Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the first Shine webinar. I'm delighted to be hosting this afternoon. My name is Dawn Horton, and I'm the Network Manager for Shine. I'm the person that has been emailing you throughout the year. I'm delighted to introduce our very special guest this afternoon, which is Professor Daniel Smith. And Professor Smith will be talking to us this afternoon about sleep and mental health in the school setting. So Professor Smith is a professor of psychiatry and an honorary consultant at the University of Glasgow. He has an honorary professorship also at the University of Edinburgh and is a prize fellow at the Lister Institute. So Professor Smith's research interests, amongst many, are genetics associated with depression and bipolar disorder. He's also very interested in data science approaches for mental health. But most importantly for our session this afternoon, he's very interested in sleep and circadian function in mood disorders. So Professor Smith holds a number of posts at the university, amongst which he leads one of the 3 primary research themes in the Institute of Health and Wellbeing at the university. And he's one of the principal investigators on the Mental Health Data Pathfinder Award and also on Shine. So we're really delighted to have him here. Still, as a practicing psychiatrist, he's obviously a very busy man, so we're delighted that he's taken some time out this afternoon to join us and share expertise. So you should now be able to see the slides for the slideshow, and I'll just run through exactly what's going to happen so that you know what to expect. So during the presentation, we will leave all the participants muted, so you'll be able to hear us, but we won't be able to hear you. So if you do have any questions during the presentation, if you could just jot those down, and then at the end of the presentation, I will invite you to ask questions. We will be recording throughout, so that will pick up any audio sound as we go along. But at the end of the webinar, I'll give you plenty of warning that I'm going to unmute all of the participants, at which point we will all be able to hear each other. And at that point, obviously, any conversations that you may be having will also be recorded. If you would like to ask a question, if you could just say your name or your school name to indicate that you would like to ask a question, I'll take a note of the names and then I'll bring you in one by one to ask your question to Professor Smith. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Professor Smith.
Thanks very much, Dawn, and welcome everyone. It's good to see so many people joining us. Hopefully you can hear me nice and clearly. I think you can. And as Dawn said, this is just going to be a really, hopefully quite an engaging but brief overview of sleep and mental health in young people. And the idea is really to stimulate some thinking around this, but also to hear some of your thoughts and to get some of your feedback and questions at the end. So I'm really hopeful that some of the stuff that I talk about will lead you to ask me some questions about the relevance of this stuff for your everyday work and life indeed. So the title is Sleep and Mental Health in Young People, and I'm going to cover 4 main areas. The first is this idea that modern living is really sort of mitigates against healthy sleep, and that is something that affects everyone, but it's something that disproportionately affects young people probably. And we can think about the reasons for that in some more detail. I'm also going to cover this idea that healthy rhythms of rest and activity and other circadian aspects of biology are really fundamental to well-being and to health, but are particularly important for mental well-being. And then again, especially important in the developing brain of people in sort of adolescence, for example. So I'm going to talk a little bit about circadian system and mental health. Then I'm going to cover what we know about the data that sleep deprivation in young people adversely affects a range of outcomes, including things like how well they'll do in exams, but also obviously things like risk of depression and anxiety and self-harm and other things like that. So I'm going to hopefully show you a little bit of that. And then on a positive note, I'm hoping to end with some useful practical steps for parents and for teachers to think about how we can sort of try to help young people have a more healthy sleep pattern, but also to engage with the rhythms of light and darkness more productively to safeguard their mental well-being. So those are the four main areas. To start off, I usually ask an audience who this person is, but I realize you can't all answer me back. So I'm going to tell you this is Thomas Edison, and he is responsible for, obviously, along with a team of people, inventing the light bulb, which occurred about 140 years ago. So if you think about it, 140 years is actually a very, very brief time in human evolution. In fact, it's a blink of an eye. And prior to the invention of the light bulb and the sort of ubiquity of nighttime illumination around the world, human beings were used to living and working in a very tight pattern of daylight versus darkness. And so that's really how we've evolved. We really have evolved to have this regular pattern of sleeping and sleeping at night and being active during daytime. One of the really interesting quotes that Thomas Edison gave, amongst many, was this one, that he regarded sleep as a criminal waste of time inherited from our cave days. So whilst that may be his opinion at the time, obviously there are some problems with that. You could argue that our cave days have made us what we are and that we continue to be, and that actually, far from a criminal waste of time, sleep obviously is an active process that's fundamental for health. One of the legacies of Edison's light bulb is this, which is a really striking demonstration of the world at nighttime, which really shows you just how widespread nighttime illumination is around the world. And if you think about 140 years ago, this map would look completely different. So this is a very recent phenomenon. It's something that humans are still adjusting to, and you could argue that humans really haven't properly adjusted to this idea that we work at nighttime, we do things in the evening that we normally wouldn't do, and that we're up early and often going to work in the darkness, for example. So our rhythms of activity and sleeping have become very disconnected from the natural rhythms of light and darkness, thanks largely to Edison and the Industrial Revolution that followed from that. So that's a kind of the pretext for what I'm going to say throughout the rest of the talk. And of course, one of the big issues is that this is getting worse rather than better. In 1950, only about a third of the world lived in an urban environment. By 2015, that had increased to over half of the world's population living in an urban environment. And the United Nations expects that by 2050, fully 2/3 of the people on the planet will live in an urban environment. And that is potentially disastrous for our health and our well-being, not to mention climate change, etc. The really important point is that people who live in urban environments are very much more likely to be disconnected from the natural rhythms of night and day because of all the artificial light and because of the pattern of 24-hour working and shift working, etc., etc. So urban living is really bad for human health in lots of ways, but it's something that is going to happen. So we really have to start to think about how do we address this in different settings. And obviously from your perspective, how can schools start to think about living in societies that are really disconnected from how most human beings evolved? So circadian rhythms, as many of you will know, are regular 24-hour, about a day, circadian rhythms of physiology, biochemistry and behavior that recur on a 24-hour basis and that are finely tuned to the cycle of the rotating Earth and finely tuned to the pattern of 12 hours daylight and 12 hours nighttime. As I said at the beginning, these rhythms have evolved throughout human history and are vital for our well-being and health, and they're particularly important for mental health. I'm going to show you some data to support that, but they're really fundamental across the whole of biology. So through the plant and animal kingdoms, regular rhythms of activity have developed to make organisms prepare for the different environmental stimuli that occur on a 24-hour basis. So In medicine generally, there's now an increasing recognition that everything that happens in the body pretty much is on a circadian cycle, and that this is now becoming well known in other areas of medicine, and increasingly it's becoming well recognized in the area of psychiatry as well. So what kind of problems result when your circadian rhythms are disrupted? Well, unfortunately, the list of disorders that have been linked to circadian disruption, and for that we could also read sleep deprivation, for example, anything from obesity, to diabetes, to Alzheimer's, chronic pain syndrome, breast cancer. For example, nurses who've worked shifts, there have been lots of prospective studies now linking shift working in women to an increased risk of breast cancer, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and of course, depression and bipolar disorder. So these are kind of the modern epidemic of disorders, obesity and diabetes particularly, and they are very closely related to dysregulation in the way that we eat and sleep and the way that we take activity. So this is fundamental to health. One of the topics in this area is something called chronotype. Many of you will know what this means, but for those of you who don't, a chronotype is your natural predisposition to prefer working in the morning or at nighttime. So for example, some people will call themselves night owls and recognize that they do their best work in the evening. Many people will think of themselves as early morning larks and are more productive in the morning time. And then there's a bunch of people in the middle. So I guess at this point you could reflect on you yourself, whether you, or maybe particularly your partner, would describe you as being a morning lark or an evening owl, because the long-term health outcomes of larks versus owls are different, unfortunately. This has actually been known for a long time, so there's lots of quotes around to support this. Benjamin Franklin, who's a famous polymath and founding father of the United States, said that early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Obviously, that also applies to women, but the point he's trying to make is that human beings evolved to get up at dawn and to be active in the morning, and they obviously evolved to go to bed at nighttime when it starts to get dark, and that this has a protective effect for many aspects of our health and well-being. The way that we regulate sleep is something that's really important to understand, and one of the most important drivers of a regular pattern of sleeping is in fact morning daylight. So daylight has the effect of essentially programming the brain to induce physiological changes that increase the brain's likelihood of sending the body to sleep in the early evening. Specifically, morning light acts at this area of the brain known as the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is close to the optic nerve, but also close to the centers in the brain, part of the limbic system, for example, which are deep structures in the brain that regulate things like activity and appetite, sexual interest, sleep patterns, etc., etc. So these limbic structures really dictate some very fundamental aspects of our daily lives, and they are impacted on by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is impacted on by light. So essentially, exposure to daylight, especially in the morning, is really fundamental for people getting off to sleep in the evening time. And daylight is really the main driver, or Zeitgeber is another term for it, for sending people to sleep later in the evening. So I want you to just bear that in mind, that part of the fundamental physiology is about exposure to light in the morning time, especially for regular patterns of sleeping. So just a little bit more information now on sleep itself. Some of you will have seen this. This is a hypnograph, I think there's a name for it, but essentially it describes on the horizontal axis, we've got time from 11 p.m. going to sleep to 7 a.m. waking up in the morning. And what you see is that there's different stages of sleep, from being awake through rapid eye movement or REM sleep, through stage 1, stage 2, and slow wave sleep. So stage 1 and 2 in slow wave sleep are deeper stages of sleep. And you'll see that in our 90-minute cycles of sleep, we go through these stages. We do that about 4 or 5 times every evening. And at the beginning of the night, we tend on balance to have much more stage 2 and much more slow wave sleep. Whereas as we get closer to 4 a.m., 6 a.m., 7 a.m., we tend to have less in the way of deep sleep, less stage 2, less slow wave sleep, and more in the way of stage 1 and REM sleep. And you'll recognize this yourselves, that the first half of the night is the kind of deep sleep that most people experience, and being awoken at that time can be very, very disruptive. Whereas the second half of the night, people tend to wake up a bit more frequently as the dawn starts to emerge. So, and this is the time when you experience a little bit more in terms of REM sleep or sleeping. The point I'm trying to make is that slow wave sleep has a very strong restorative function, whereas REM sleep seems to help with things like memory consolidation and that kind of thing. So sleep, as this diagram illustrates, is an extremely active sort of brain process. It's not in any way a sort of passive event. It's very fundamentally an active thing for the brain. So of course, why do we sleep is an important question. And obviously people have struggled with this for many hundreds of years trying to explain this. But I think it's fair to say that there are about 3 or 4 main possible reasons for human beings sleeping the way we do. One idea is that we conserve energy when we're sleeping. And that's true to a certain extent. Obviously, we're not generally walking around, but the brain is extremely active during sleep. So there's still quite a bit of energy being expended during nighttime. It's definitely the case that sleep is restorative and helps with recovery of the brain and different areas of the body. That's hard to deny. But increasingly, the accepted view of why we sleep is that sleep is just fundamental for healthy brain functioning. So particularly in terms of memory, particularly in terms of learning and information processing, regular patterns of deep sleep and then superficial sleep as well are really important for each of these brain functions. And you will know this as teachers that, I'm guessing the best advice you give your students before an exam obviously is to not revise, but rather just get a decent night's sleep. And we know that when people do that, their memory recall, their information processing is much better than, not sleeping properly. So that's not a big surprise, I guess, to many teachers, but it may be a surprise that the main reason for sleeping is to have these brain functions operating correctly. So just to introduce a little bit of the research that we've done here in Glasgow that demonstrates some of these connections between circadian systems and mental health symptoms. This was a study published last year in the Lancet Psychiatry where we used a cohort called the UK Biobank cohort, which is a very large cohort of middle-aged people from the United Kingdom. About 100,000 people in that cohort wore actigraphs or wrist-worn Fitbits, from which we were able to derive information on their patterns of activity and sleep and the rhythms of activity and sleep. And we were able to assess whether that was associated with lifetime history of having things like mood disorders or neuroticism or cognitive impairment, that kind of thing. And essentially, to summarize it, what we found it was that there was a kind of across the board, there was an association between disrupted rhythmicity of sleep and activity as measured by these wrist actigraphs and an increased risk of things like depression, bipolar disorder, more mood instability, more neuroticism, lower overall self-rated happiness, lower health satisfaction, even greater loneliness, and slower reaction time as well. So, and that's just a measure of cognitive functioning. So really that was covered widely in the press. Some of you may have seen that study at the time, because this is very topical. We know that modern living is disrupting circadian rhythms on a scale never before experienced. And we know that things like depression and overall happiness are declining, and that there's a link between the two. In fact, it was so popular that it got to be the front page of the Times the next morning after it was published. And I made the mistake during that interview with the journalist of saying that one of the solutions here is to switch off your mobile phone at 10 p.m. to stay happy. But obviously this study didn't look at mobile phone use in any way, shape or form, but it's not a bad message in the end, actually. So the key point is that we should be paying more attention to when we go to sleep and to basically being inactive in darkness and active during daylight. So that's a key message for everyone, not just school children. But getting back to teenagers, which is what we're all interested in, I guess, is that Our chronotype preference, which I mentioned earlier, either you're an early morning lark or maybe a night owl, that tends to change as you get older. So anyone who's ever had a child will know that young children are born without a chronotype, in the sense that they're all extreme night owls. They basically are active at nighttime and inactive during the day. That changes as they get older. Very old, much older people tend to be more busy in the morning, so they're morning larks. But the key point for this talk is that most teenagers, physiologically, are night owls, which means that they are programmed to go to sleep much later than other people at other ages. So their melatonin, the hormone that builds up during the day in response to sunlight, that builds up but peaks much later in teenagers than it does in other people, such that teenagers are really not biochemically ready to go to sleep until well after 10 p.m. And yet I think we're all trying to get them to go to sleep around that time still, or maybe not. The key point is they still need a lot of sleep. They still need at least 9 hours sleep. But of course, the way society is organized, especially in the winter time, we're asking these teenagers who are really programmed to wake up about 9 or 10 in the morning. We're asking them to get up even earlier than that. So maybe 6:30, 7 o'clock to get on a bus to go to school, when really their body is still asleep at that time. The result is that many studies have confirmed that in the UK and other countries like the UK, most teenagers are in fact sleep deprived. And yet the idea that we would change their routines is very challenging. Although this has been tried in some countries, and we can talk about that in the questions if you like. So what do we know about the data on sleep deprivation in young people? Well, there's now been a lot of work in this area. Lots of things have been assessed. So we know, for example, that sleep deprivation in teenagers does directly impact on concentration, memory consolidation, attention, and that kind of thing. There have also been studies that have linked sleep deprivation directly to behavioral disruption, including bullying activities or aggression. And then, I guess, quite interestingly, sleep-deprived teenagers are more likely to take risks. So that includes things like drug experimentation or alcohol use, but also driving recklessly, etc., etc. So it's not just their sort of concentration and their mental health, it's other activities that are related to sleep deprivation, like risk-taking. And of course, worse emotional regulation. So sleep-deprived teenagers find it much more difficult to regulate their response to stress. So they're more likely to report anxiety symptoms or to report depression symptoms, because it's just so much more challenging to self-regulate your emotions when you're sleep deprived. And I think that everyone will recognize that, but it's particularly acute for young people. So just to bring us towards a conclusion and hopefully towards a discussion, I just thought I'd try to offer some practical solutions, which many of you will know already, but hopefully some useful tips to make sleep a priority, and also things that society maybe should be thinking about. So one of the most important things we can do is to get rid of daylight saving time. We've just had that change maybe 2 weeks ago. That directly affects people's mood and well-being in an adverse way. It's being abolished across Europe, and unfortunately with Brexit, we're going to miss out on the abolition of daylight saving time unless the UK government also decide to abolish it. But that's a really important thing that should go, because we should be much more in tune with the natural rhythms of sunrise and sunset. For everyone, including teenagers, more exposure to morning light is really important to program the brain in terms of being ready to go to sleep in the evening. And then we can think about the way we work and organize teaching, I guess. So shift work is a bad idea for your health in lots of ways. We should be thinking about more flexible working. Active commuting is really important. So being in the fresh air and getting exposure to daylight on your way to work and on the way back from work. And in other countries of the world, like Canada and Scandinavia, it's becoming more commonplace to have circadian lighting in workplaces and in hospitals, and increasingly in schools as well. So that in Scotland, I think that's something that we could really think carefully about. Can we provide artificial light, daylight, essentially, to kids in the winter time in schools? We think it'll help with their sleep patterns. It probably will help with their concentration, etc. Also at night, there are some very simple steps you can take at home. So when the sun goes down, you shouldn't have bright lights on anywhere in your home. It should all be soft lighting. It goes without saying that screen time in the evenings is bad. You'll know that part of the reason for that is that the blue light emitted by many of these devices directly inhibits melatonin secretion and therefore interrupts with the drive to go to sleep. So the blue light from these devices can be very harmful. Soft lighting at home after work, after dark, I've mentioned. I hope none of you will have your TV or phone or your device in the bedroom. I'm sure you don't. And I'm sure you all also switch off your phones at 10 p.m. every night as well. So those are some simple steps. I've kind of mentioned this already, but schools could think about later start times. In countries where this has been tried, later start times have been associated with better academic performance, less truancy, less bullying, etc. So that seems to be something that could be worth trying, especially in Scotland. Some people have suggested that every day should begin with PE outside as the first lesson of the day. I think that's a good idea, but not everyone will agree with that. More lessons outside sounds very sensible. That's very common in Scandinavia, especially even during the winter. Kids in Scandinavia will have outside lessons, even in sub-zero temperatures, just so that they get exposure to daylight. We should think about examination timing. It's not fair if you happen to be the young person in the class who's the exception and he's the morning lark, and you do your GC or you do your higher maths at 9 o'clock in the morning. That's unfair. Examinations should be in the afternoons to give everyone an equal chance. And as I've already mentioned, circadian lighting is something that schools could think about in the winter time. And what about for yourself? How can you have better sleep hygiene? You'll find this information all over the place, but just to reiterate it, a regular pattern of going to bed at the same time every night and getting out of bed at the same time every morning, including the weekends, helps to regulate your pattern of sleep. Bedrooms should be dark and cool. Beds should only be for sleeping in and for sex. You should have a bedtime routine. You shouldn't really take caffeine after midday because of the long half-life of caffeine. And that's something I've tried in the last 6 months. I've stopped. My last caffeine is at lunchtime, and I've noticed that if I don't have any caffeine, you do sleep better. It's definitely worth thinking about. Exercise outside during the day, every day is important. And then if you do have insomnia, insomnia is usually short-lived. If you don't worry about insomnia, it usually gets better. So the best thing you can do when you can't sleep is to not think about not sleeping. Just get up, do something else, go back to bed in 20 minutes. So stay calm when you can't sleep, because it'll probably be nothing. I'm going to stop there, but just to summarize, I hope we've covered sleep and modern living, circadian disruption and the effects on mental health in both adults and in younger people. I hope I've emphasized that sleep deprivation is ubiquitous in teenagers. It affects educational attainment. The way we structure school and learning is problematic for many teenagers and something we have a responsibility to think about. And hopefully I've suggested some of the practical steps that you may or may not agree with just now. But thanks for your attention. I'll hand you back to Dawn.
Okay, thank you very much. Looking at the time and seeing that it's 4:30, it will almost certainly be dark outside, but I don't think we can quite go to bed just yet. But that was really insightful.
Oh, I should have mentioned, sorry Dawn, if you're really interested in this stuff, there's two books I'd recommend, but we'll send you these slides as well. Yeah. One is Matthew Walker's book on why we sleep, and the other is Linda Geddes' book called Chasing the Sun, The Science of Sunlight. So if you're keen on that, I would recommend getting those books and having a read.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So now we're going to move to the part of the webinar where you'll be able to ask some questions to Danny about the presentation. Can I ask a question just to kick off? So you were talking a little bit about children going to school later, potentially. How much later would you envisage?
So the studies that have been done in Canada and in North America, other parts of North America, it's only been 1 hour difference for many studies. So just letting teenagers go to school at 10, start school at 10 a.m. Right. Seems to make a difference in terms of their well-being and their employment. So it doesn't have to be very late. So just that extra hour in bed seems to be helpful. Just a question about sleep debt. We all suffer from this. Is it not a good idea to catch up on sleep at the weekend? You suggest it was better to try. Yes. Yeah, so there is mixed data on this. Some studies say that catching up with sleep at the weekend is a good thing. Other studies say that it's not a good thing because it just encourages people to have an unhealthy pattern of sleeping in the longer term. And of course, not everyone can guarantee their Saturday lie-ins. So I wouldn't say give up your Saturday lie-ins, because that's hard to do. But I would say that as far as possible, try to get up out of bed at the same time. And of course, that means go to bed at the same time every night as well, which is also difficult. Yeah. But so I think the evidence isn't very clear that we can't say you should definitely not lie in at the weekends. It does, your brain does recover after a lie-in a bit, but the long-term goal, I think, should be to not to need a lie-in, to have your lifestyle such that it's okay to get up more or less the same time every day.
Do we have any questions? It's just such a good presentation. You've covered everything, you see. Well, another question. So you can still continue to type in any questions, should you have any. I'll maybe just give out a couple of messages while we're waiting, and we can pick up at the end. So there's just a few things to let you know about. The study that Danny mentioned earlier with the adults wearing actigraphs, we've been delighted that we've been out in 4 of our Shine schools collecting actigraph data recently. Oh, we have a question. Fantastic. Right, so I'll tell you more about that. So it says, changes to the school day would have serious repercussions on timetabling and resources. Do you think there is enough understanding and appetite from government to allow us to consider making these sort of changes?
So there are 2 things I would say to this. It's a really good question. I actually did go to see people in the Scottish Government about this recently, and apparently they are going to start thinking about it. They also told me that actually many schools are free to decide themselves when they start and when they end. So it is the case that if a particular school wanted to implement allowing their teenagers to start at 10 o'clock in the morning, it is within many schools' power to do that. And I guess many schools could try that on a trial basis. Obviously, it messes up timetables and all the rest of it, and that is something to think about. But I think there is a growing appetite in the Scottish Government to think about this, because this could be a relatively inexpensive thing with potentially quite cost-effective health benefits in the very long term, and it's the kind of thing that the Scottish Government are interested in. But I would say, yeah, there is growing appetite, and if schools wanted to try this on a trial basis, then many schools are free to do that, I think. So it may be worth asking your colleagues at school.
So it tends to be by local authority. There's obviously some variation in times of the school day. So, okay, do we have any more questions? Thank you, Becky, for that question.
How would you advise teenagers to put their phones away? Any top tips? So, well, you just turn off the Wi-Fi at 10 o'clock.
You can do.
I don't have any wisdom. My eldest is only 12, maybe Dawn knows better.
Yeah, I have older teenagers, and I would say it's a constant conversation that we revisit many times. And I don't think anybody ever gets it completely right, but I think it's important to keep having the conversation and to keep emphasising and explaining why, and not just saying put it away, but actually underlining the reasons. So I'm fairly sure I will be showing this presentation to my 2 so that they can understand why I'm so keen for them to put it away. But yeah.
I mean, I think there maybe just should be a general rule that, devices shouldn't be in the bedroom, so that whenever people go to bed, no way should a phone be in the room, really, for all sorts of reasons. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that question. Any more?
So I guess I'm interested to know if, in general, any of this stuff is new, or to what extent is any of this covered in curricula or lessons in schools? Is it covered in biology? Is it covered in PSE? Is there an opportunity to cover some of this circadian biology stuff?
I'm aware of a lot of schools in the network certainly having huge campaigns on sleep, and,
Right.
and definitely putting that on the agenda very much. So please do type in and tell us if it's on the agenda in your school, or if you feel that you've learnt a lot of new things this evening that you'll be taking back to implement. Any feedback would be great. But it is increasingly, I think, on the agenda, and people want the information so that they can pass it on. But yes, it certainly crops up in PSE.
Yeah, so Becky's saying sleep's in their PSE, people's really interested in science. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe more of that could happen.
Yep.
And ultimately, if they know more about the science of rhythms, then that can help with turning off your phones to an extent.
Yeah.
To an extent.
I think with everything, with teenagers, they don't want to just be told don't do it. They want to know why, and they, particularly the science will be of interest, I would say. Yeah. Okay. So please do continue to type. I'm just going to give a couple of messages. Oh, wait, hang on. Yeah, we tried to, another question there. So we tried to include, so this is saying that sleep is included in PSE, and they all say they switch off the blue light function on their phones, and that is enough for them.
Well, no, because they're not sleeping.
Yeah.
But then you know that.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, fair. Yeah. So.
I was actually at a Sleep Scotland event recently, and they said that it doesn't matter if it's blue light, green light, or any light, it's just light, as Danny very clearly pointed out at the start of the presentation, that light will interfere with the sleep. So yes, I've been told that by my teenagers as well. So, yeah. Okay, so we have one more question. Yep. So S4 prelims are underway, and I have been trying to emphasize the need for sleep in preparation for exams and revising, but many pupils still unaware of the benefits of a good night's sleep. Yeah.
So there's lots of really accessible information on this where you can actually demonstrate. You can even do the experiments at school, so you can demonstrate that depriving someone of sleep prevents them remembering stuff effectively. So it directly affects performance and things like exams. So I'm sure on the internet there's various resources that actually show the data for that, or even YouTube and all that kind of stuff. So it's pretty. There's been many studies to suggest that in young people especially, the ones who have a proper night's sleep do remember things more effectively, and it's because memories are consolidated during sleep. Put very simply. Yeah, so I'm sure that sort of information could be embraced more. As someone's saying, Peter's saying, we do cover sleep in biology, psychology, as well as PSE. The information is out there, but not always embraced. They do have a fear of missing out. Yeah, so it's really challenging, for sure.
Yeah, and that's certainly something that in the Shine reports we reported back on as well, that fear of missing out, relatively new concept. So again, with your reports that you have, you might want to have a look at that, look at the sleep data versus the fear of missing out, and see how it relates to a few of the different pieces of information.
I suppose one thing I would add is just that getting through to young people, and actually to adults as well, just how recent social media is in the grand scheme of things. It's just so new in terms of human evolution that we cannot possibly expect our bodies to be adapted for this. And just that comes into the biology, I guess, and how humans evolved and all the rest of it. But it really is a blink of an eye, and trying to impress that upon them is important, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm now going to draw to a close, unless there's a question that comes in the next 30 seconds. So obviously, I think that's been a fascinating presentation. Loads of information there, and thank you so much, obviously, for joining in and asking questions, and also giving us some feedback as well in terms of what's going on in your schools. As we've always said, Shine is really there to be an interface between health research and schools, and I think this has been a fantastic first webinar this evening to really embrace that aim of the network. So really delighted with that. We have many bits and pieces coming up in the near future, so taking those reports, we're now in the evaluation stage, so we're going to be out in schools in the next few months, speaking to teachers and pupils and health and wellbeing leads and data leads in the local authorities to evaluate the impact of the Shine Health and Wellbeing data reports. So we're really excited to get out and meet people and do that. Also, lots to look forward to in January 2020. The Health Behaviour in School-Aged Children National Report, the Scottish report, will be out. And so you'll be able to see the full report at that point. And also in January, we'll be launching the Shine online pupil mental health surveys, which you'll be able to use in your schools to survey as many pupils as you would like as well. So we're very excited about that development, particularly for those of you who weren't involved in the HBSC data collection. This will be the first time that we'll be able to work with you to help you collect some of your own mental health data. And that should be really a great step forward. So it just remains for me to thank Danny. I don't know whether you have any closing comments anything that you would like to say.
Thanks for attending. Thanks for your participation, everyone.
It's been a really interesting afternoon and a great first webinar. So thank you so much for sharing your afternoon with us and all your expertise. And hopefully this will be the first of many in our webinar series. So within the next few minutes, we'll be closing down the meeting. So just like to thank you all again for your fantastic participation, for your questions and your input, and give us some feedback as well. So thank you very much, and until next time.